Let's pretend it's the end of this whole ugly story. We vanquished the foe and we triumphed in glory. There's nothing but rainbows and blue skies ahead. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end. We threw off the yoke and we broke all the shackles. We tore down the walls and we burned down the castle. The oppressors all scattered and naked they fled. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end.
Welcome to Before the Future Came, a Star Trek podcast. We're looking at the utopian ideals of Star Trek as we voyage from one work to the next, following a breadcrumb trail of motifs. Last episode, we discussed the video game Star Trek Voyager Elite Force, which had some questionable military ethics in it. This month, we're talking about an episode which also asks what role morality has in war, Inquisition, the 18th episode of Season 6, written by Bradley Thompson and David Weddle, and directed by Michael Dorn, who's the actor of Worf. This is one of only 4 episodes of Star Trek that he directed. I'm Gregory, a visionary who helped bring an end to one of the most devastating wars the galaxy has ever seen.
I'm Melissa, and none of it was real, but I am.
And I'm Lucy, and I'm going to a conference, not a vacation.
Lissa, you picked this month's episode, so please give us a summary in your own words.
All right. Chief Medical Officer's Log, stardate, somewhere in 2374. Deep Space Nine's very tired Chief Medical Officer, Julian Bashir, is just about to head to a medical conference on Casperia when Deputy Director Luther Sloan of Starfleet's Internal Affairs shows up to investigate a suspected security breach aboard DS9. Bashir ain't going to the conference, and all the senior officers are confined to quarters. Bashir's troubles start off easy. Sloan's first interview with Bashir is very friendly, and they quickly establish a rapport, although Sloan's team manages to mix up Bashir's breakfast with Worf's, leaving him very hungry on top of being very tired. After the interview, Bashir realizes his quarters have been searched, and he receives a well-timed call from an oddly stiff Chief Miles O'Brien, who says he was just interviewed for 2 hours about Bashir. Bashir's second interview goes much less well. Sloan digs into Bashir's time in a Dominion internment camp, accusing Bashir of being a secret, even to himself, agent of the Dominion, courtesy of so-called engrammatic dissociation. Bashir's claims of innocence are ignored. Sloan's team walks a handcuffed Bashir slowly through the promenade, making sure everybody sees him on the way to the brig. Great moment. Captain Benjamin Sisko swings by the brig to show his support and insists that he be present in all interrogation sessions to make sure that Bashir's rights are being respected. Sloan agrees, easily. The third interview goes even worse, but at least Sisko is there. Bashir is grilled on a bunch of questionable things that have happened in his career. His lying about his genetic modifications, helping the Jem'Hadar with medical problems, and helping some genetically engineered children. I don't remember that episode very well, but...
Those are the geniuses, the 4 genetically modified people who have social challenges.
Oh, those weirdos.
And they're like, we're going to lose the war, so we should just give up. And then they all learn a valuable lesson about individuality.
I had thought that those episodes were about Section 31, so this all wraps up together. So remember how I said it was good that Sisko was there? Well, at this point, even Sisko starts to wonder if Bashir is an agent with suppressed memories. So Sloan and his group make a move to snatch Bashir off of DS9 under the auspices that he's a threat that must be neutralized. But as they go to put the handcuffs on him, Bashir is beamed out. He's taken to a Jem'Hadar ship, where the Vorta Weyoun 5, who we've seen quite a lot at this point in DS9.
At least 4 other times.
Fair. Welcomes him home. Weyoun asks if Bashir was injured, noting he doesn't see any bruises on a man dressed neck to toe in a Starfleet uniform. They begin a song and dance where Weyoun tries to get Bashir to uncover his real memories, including offering him the scone breakfast he wasn't given that morning. Somehow, Bashir has not yet wondered aloud if he is in a holodeck simulation. Wayne's ship is suddenly attacked by the Defiant. Bashir is quickly rescued by Kira and Worf, but the entire bridge crew turns on Bashir since he was rescued from Sloan by the Jem'Hadar. But the programmers of the simulation missed something. O'Brien had been hurt the day before, but shows no sign of the injury in this scene. After Bashir pronounces the whole thing to be not real, the holodeck simulation is put to an end. Sloan and his people, who were all dressed in black leather outfits with the cut of the Starfleet dress uniforms, badass, reveal that Bashir was beamed into the holodeck shortly after he went to sleep the night before, and that they're now pretty sure that Bashir is innocent. Sloan says he really works for Section 31, not Internal Affairs, which Bashir and the audience has never heard of at that point. Section 31 was part of the original Starfleet Charter 200 years ago and continues to act completely autonomously. Bashir is incredulous and horrified. Sloan is very proud of how only extraordinary people could do the work that they do.
Mm-hmm.
Sloan moves into a recruiting pitch, but Bashir isn't having it, so he's drugged and sent back to DS9. Later, Sisko reveals to Bashir, Kira, and Odo that Sloan isn't in Starfleet records at all, and that when asked about Section 31, he was told Starfleet would look into it and get back to him. When the group discusses the difficulty of hunting down Section 31, Sisko says they won't have to, because Section 31 will come to them in order to recruit Bashir again. Sisko orders Bashir to say yes the next time they come around.
Yay!
Love Section 31.
Love them. Fucking love them. They're the best. And the worst.
I mean, they're terrible, but yeah, it's a great concept.
It is.
I have a clarifying question.
Mm-hmm.
What's up with the dropping the pencil under the couch thing?
I think that's just to make us remember that he took his pad out and put it on the table, because later one of the ways he knows his room has been searched is because the pad is back in his bag.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah, that was my read on it too.
Yeah, I was expecting like them to have moved the stylus, or for him to pick up the stylus and find a bug or something like that. But yeah, there's not a payoff in that way.
Yeah.
To be honest, I thought he was going to actually turn out to have been a Dominion plant, and real Bashir has been still in that Jem'Hadar internment camp all this time. But I think that was an episode with O'Brien where that happened.
Yeah, I mean, Bashir has previously had that happen.
Oh yeah, well maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
Are we ready?
Let's do it.
We've each brought a topic for discussion. Mine is my favorite topic, assessment. So I am very excited to finally get to talk about something that I am an actual expert on, which is assessment. I'm a college professor in education, and I'm currently writing a book on assessment, so this is on my mind. And then it turned out that this whole episode is basically a test. So I thought that the obvious thing for us to do is to evaluate the quality of this assessment. So,
Excellent.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. And we're going to do so using some of the keys to assessment that Jan Chapelus and Rick Stiggins created. So this is like a generalized keys to assessment idea, although I'll supplement with a few other things as well. We're only going to talk about their first three keys because I don't think that some of the other things, they're a little bit more education oriented. So I'm just going to talk about the first three keys a bit. So one of the first keys to understanding assessment is having a clear purpose. So if y'all would indulge me for a moment, what would you say is the purpose of this assessment? And I think this will largely be based on that final scene with Sloan and Bashir, where Sloan sort of reveals his modus operandi.
I think it's to establish Bashir's like loyalty and resistance to coercion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's also what I feel. So I do think we have a clear purpose for this assessment. We know what Sloan's goal is in trying to ascertain. Now, the next key to assessment is understanding whether we have clear targets or not. And in this case, the target, what he wants to know, this sort of loyalty test, it's definitely a performance skill, right? This is something that he wants Bashir to do, a performance, a response to like sort of the scenario, right?
To like withstand coercion? Is that the action, the performance?
Yeah, I would say so. And just to give it a little context, other possible targets would be like a knowledge target. Like if he wanted to find out if Julian knew a few specific things, that would be knowledge, but he's not interested in what Julian knows, right? He's not interested in Julian's reasoning. Like that's clearly not what he's interested in. He's not interested in a product of some kind. He is interested in the performance of this particular set of skills or behaviors that Bashir produces or doesn't produce, right, in the test.
Yeah.
And the way he has set up this assessment is as a performance task. That is, he has given us a very detailed scenario that Julian is supposed to perform in. And good news, a performance task is a very strong match for a performance skill learning target. So Sloan did a great job of choosing the appropriate method of assessment for what he is assessing.
Well, but he doesn't actually seem to have metrics.
Well, we're going to get into design next.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Yes, so we have established purpose and we've talked about targets, right? And so far, so good. I think we have a quality assessment so far. But now we're going to talk about design. And I think this is where we're going to find perhaps multiple issues with the assessment. For one thing, a particular issue with the design of this task has to do with the sample, I would say. So when you're designing an assessment, you want to think like how many questions, how much stuff do you want the learner to do, right? What do you want? How much are you going to need them to produce in order to determine whether they have accomplished your goal? And I think there is a lot of there's a lot of problems around that sample in this assessment. Generally, you want to have a sense of consistency of performance, and I think there is no way that this assessment can offer us any idea about whether Julian would respond in the same way on a different day and under different circumstances, right? I think we're very limited in what we're going to learn from this scenario. So I think in terms of sample, we immediately are going to have a problem. Now, I would say, I guess I will have to provide a little additional context. There are two general types of assessments for us in education. I'd argue, actually, there's a third, but I'm not going to talk about that. Y'all can read my book in 2025 when that comes out.
Yes.
But the two generally accepted types of assessment are formative and summative. So formative assessment is telling you information while a learner is still in progress. And in that case, you really want feedback to be able to be available to the learner and perhaps the teacher as well. Whereas a summative assessment is just a sort of final test where you are like, you pass or fail. Have we learned what we need to know about this person? I think this is definitely a summative assessment. This is not formative. This is summative. When I'm telling this to my students, I always explain it as a formative assessment is like a well child visit. When you take your kiddo to the doctor and, just get a yearly physical, or for grownups, if y'all, go get your yearly physical, that's a formative assessment. Summative assessment is an autopsy, right? What did you learn, right? What do we learn? And usually it's not the learner that learns from the summative assessment, it's the teacher. Yeah, people usually remember my metaphor. So I think what we are looking at is a summative assessment here, and it's high stakes, and it's a complex task. So we're working with a lot of different things here. I found this really important. This is a quote from Chapwis and Stiggins. They said, when identifying the context for the task, make sure you are not introducing challenges unrelated to the learning you want to assess. I think that's a pretty significant problem here. And where that comes up in Chapwis and Stiggins is in a part about authenticity. Sometimes teachers want to make a task real world. I'm using quotation marks. They want to make the task more authentic or real world. And so they'll make changes to the task that actually muddy their assessment results. I think Sloan has done that. I think by trying to be authentic and create this holodeck experience that feels really real, he's actually introduced lots of bias and distortion of his assessment results. Of course, in educational testing, depriving the subject of food and sleep would be a big no-no in messing up your assessment results. But
bad news.
in this case, I do think it's part of what he thinks he's assessing, right? Like, he thinks he's assessing Julian under duress. And I do think, I mean, I don't know, we can argue about whether that's good assessment or not. I think the real problem here, though, is by using the holodeck as the context for this test, what he does is basically introduce a whole other test that Julian does very well on, which is figuring out he's in a holodeck scenario, right? Like, Julian is suspicious pretty early on, right? Like, I think we were just talking about, like, some of the things he notices, right? Like, he's noticing that things are awry, that something's not right, and he's already, like, wondering what's happening. And then by the time he gets to the ship where the people that he knows are, he's very quick, right? Like, he's very quick to notice all of their behavioral inconsistencies, and he sorts the whole thing out. So I think the big problem with the assessment overall is really how Sloan has introduced a lot of complexities to the task that don't actually, so in the end, he's not actually testing Julian's loyalty at all, right? Because he can't be, because Julian figures it out. If Julian understands that this is a holodeck scenario, then he's not actually being tested for his loyalty. I think the question that Lissa brought up too about criteria is another potential issue, and it's troubling to me that Sloan doesn't dig into Julian figuring out the scenario in the holodeck. He doesn't dig into how Julian responds to some of the different parts of what happened. Like, his interaction with Cisco is pretty interesting, but we don't dig into any of those things. It just sort of boils down to, oh, are you loyal to Starfleet or to the Federation? I think it's Starfleet that he's concerned about loyalty toward. Mm-hmm. So I would argue, if one of my students had submitted this as their assessment,
you would contact their advisor.
I'd write some feedback to them, making some suggestions, particularly for their design. I think their design has a lot of issues. I would want Sloan to produce a rubric. I do think that would be, it's very healthy to have a rubric for a performance task, and I think that would be beneficial to us as well. But I think even the rubric wouldn't solve the essential problem, which is he set up a task that has so many other things happening in it that I think his actual data, the thing he wants to know, ends up being sort of subsumed in all of that.
I want to push back a little bit on that, though.
Please.
Because I don't know if the summary got to this level of detail, but Bashir has an implant behind his ear that is letting Section 31 monitor his, like, emotional and neurological responses.
Oh, yeah.
And so it may be that that's where the rubric sits, right? Like, they're looking for a certain reading from that device.
I forgot to mention that as part of the data for the assessment. It's observational data and the neuroelectric responses. Mm-hmm. But he does already say he's pretty sure before he reads the neuroelectric responses. So I don't think that those are the only component on your rubric there, right? I think he's obviously using multiple metrics for that.
Yeah, the fact that he was pretty convinced before he had that data means that it's at least heavily skewed. Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't like, we can't tell until we see the numbers. He was like, well, based on your performance, you're probably good, but I guess we'll check this last bit of the rubric.
To me, the neuroelectric responses felt more like he was looking to correlate what he was already thinking, which honestly is another problem if you're talking about assessment, right? Like, you actually wouldn't want to assess in that way. What I would want would be to have somebody who wasn't doing the observations read the neuroelectric responses separately. That way you'd sort of be having a check to understanding your data, but that is neither here nor there.
So how would you design, if you were presented with, Julian Bashir, one thing that I was unclear on in this episode, do they suspect that he has been brainwashed? Like, is the scenario that they're presenting actually what they're concerned about? Or are they just like, we don't want you to crack under this sort of manipulation? I don't know.
It's a good question.
I think it's a super good question. I mean, I personally don't think that they think he is brainwashed, because it seems like a lot of trouble to go through if you think he's that story that they tell him, right? Like, it doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
So are they really testing ends and the means? Are they testing that, like, they want him to be willing to... I don't know. How would you design this test?
Well, I'm taking Sloan at his word at the end, which I realize is a problem. But that's all I have to go on, is he says that he did this to test his loyalty to Starfleet. So if I were going to be testing his loyalty to Starfleet, I mean, honestly, I don't want to sound like a huge qualitative researcher nerd, but honestly, I think an interview protocol would be my starting point, because I think really I understand they're Section 31, they're spies, and so they think everything needs to be a spy thing, but I don't know that that's actually the best way to find out what you want to find out. People almost always tell you what you want to know when you ask them the right questions, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I think if you designed an interview appropriately, I think you'd probably learn what you needed to learn from an interview. I mean, I think I'd probably do something similar to what, like, our special services do too, like interview people, right? Like, know, like, what he's like in his life, and not try and construct this elaborate scenario that, honestly, like we pointed out, he's already been through before multiple times.
Yeah. And it feels like if you want to check if someone is going to betray the Federation or betray Starfleet, you want to give them motivation to do so, right? Mm-hmm. Like, they gaslight Bashir and are like, you're an agent even though you don't think you are. And, like, that doesn't actually test whether or not... That tests whether or not he's gullible. But like, what does failure look like?
Exactly.
I guess is what I'm like... Like, is failure assuming that he's like, well, you offered me scones, so I guess you're right that you brainwashed me? But he wasn't brainwashed. So,
and he's very sure that he's not brainwashed, right? Like, you know, I mean, I guess a little bit of a spoiler, I did briefly consider the "There Are Four Lights" episode as the next one to read, because I was thinking about it in watching this, but, like, Bashir is he's never trying to say there are four lights, right? Like, the whole time he's like, no, no, you're all wrong. And, like, why are you doing this? So it's like, it's not that at all for him.
Those scones did look good, though.
They did. If they wanted to paint a scenario for Bashir to test his loyalty, they've already said what it would be. Find someone, maybe someone genetically engineered, who needs help that he could provide, and that is a slip slide right into it, right? Like, you could set that scenario up to test his loyalty, and it would align with ostensibly what they're looking for. Maybe this whole thing is a recruiting thing, and the resilience and so on was for purposes of recruiting to Section 31. Who knows? But, yeah.
Sloan does note that they ended the assessment early because of the O'Brien shoulder mix-up. So maybe there was a second phase where they do better stuff, but I don't know. I feel like you shouldn't lead with the worst part of your assessment.
I mean, I think I agree 100%. I think he did a bad job. If you're recruiting somebody who is very intelligent, we'll say, and observant, and highly resistant, which are some of the things they're clearly interested in Bashir, well, he's gonna see through your dumb scenario at some point, right? Especially once you confront him with people he actually knows. I mean, he's already he's already concerned because Wei-Yun, he's like, why are you trying to convince me as the same thing as that other guy was, right? Like, that's immediately a flaw. And then when he sees how people he knows very well behave, he's like, nah, this is ridiculous. So the test is it's testing something else. I'd say it is pretty good at testing Julian's reasoning ability, even with not having a good night of sleep and food.
I think you and I have different perceptions of what Bashir was picking up on in the earlier parts of this episode. I think he was picking up on the fact that Sloan was sus, not the fact that he was in a simulation. I think this poor man made it all the way through that episode before really thinking this is a fucking holodeck simulation.
I mean, with how many times that's happened to him?
I know.
Maybe he's like, it can't possibly be. There's that one time when I was alone on the station. There's that other time when they replaced me with a replicant. Or I think O'Brien is the replicant one. I think Bashir is a changeling. Like, maybe he's like, it boggles probability that I would once again be put into a simulation.
He also, though, I mean, I would say the performer is like, I don't know, I don't know what he's thinking in some of those early scenes. Like, I don't feel like...
Bashir?
Yeah. Like, I'm still confused about the pencil under the couch. Like, I don't know exactly what I was meant. Like, I was thinking all kinds of things. Like, did the pencil disappear and then it comes back later? Is that a clue? Like, I see what you're saying about the how it points out the pad, but the pencil itself just rolled under the couch. That seems like and then he found it.
Well, I think if the stylus had been with the pad, the way it was originally, that would have triggered a different set of thought of like, well, did I move it at all? Or, right? But the fact that the thing was half back where it was originally caused a different train of thought.
Yeah, it presented a scenario in which kind of the only explanation is that his stuff was messed with, and also like maybe is meant to give the audience a little bit of unsettledness, right? Because that agent saw him digging under the couch.
Mm-hmm.
So if they had searched the place, they would have lifted that couch up and would have found that stylus there and would have been like, oh, we should leave the like if they didn't care enough to get the teddy bear and the pad in the right position, why did they leave the pencil and if the stylus, and if they chose to leave the style, you know what I mean? Like,
I do know what you mean.
If they didn't notice the stylus, yeah.
I think it's poor assessment design.
Fair enough.
Yep.
Well, thank you all for participating. I'll include this in my book.
Look forward to it.
All right. So, I want to talk about astonishment in Star Trek. I can maybe talk a little bit how I got to this topic later. But I should really preface this whole thing by saying that Bashir is sort of a idealistic, naive character, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, he is well established to sort of want to see the best in people and all that sort of thing. So, all of this, kind of view that through this lens. One way that Star Trek tries to sell us on its utopian vision is by on screen having people be shocked at quote-unquote bad systems, right? We believe that Bashir believes he lives in a world that doesn't have a secret evil spy organization in his government because he is shocked to find out that there is one. When he finds out that Section 31 is, we're taking Sloan at his word for what that's worth, but Section 31 was built into the Starfleet Charter, that's like a real moment for Bashir in which the system is not broken, it is working as intended. Right?
Yeah.
And that's a thing that a lot of people have to learn in a very hard way.
Yeah. Odo is not surprised at all.
Exactly.
Odo's like, yeah, the Romulans have Tal Shiar, the Cardassians have the Obsidian Order, you've got Section 31, clearly.
Exactly.
Cisco is also pretty nonplussed about it.
Uh-huh. That spectrum of reactions, exactly. Bashir is shocked. Cisco is less surprised and doesn't kind of want to believe it fully automatically, right? Like, he's willing to repeat what Starfleet told him back. And then Odo is just like, well, of course. I don't remember if Kira says anything. I don't have noted that Kira says anything in that scene about that. But Bashir having to realize that it's not that there are, let's say, some bad apples in internal affairs. It's that this organization exists and is sanctioned. That self-policing was built this way from the get-go. Because this assessment was so terrible, it's in search of a truth. Some sort of truth, undefined, because there was no clear rubric to anybody involved. The flow of Bashir's emotions, as we can tell over the course of this episode, are just him falling into this simulation with his whole ass. He, in that first interview, when he goes in and Sloan is really chummy, which, to me, incredibly suspicious. For one, that actor, I'll talk about William Sadler later, that man's amazing. But, incredibly suspicious. Anyone, us in our society, we go, oh, an internal affairs cop? We've seen cop shows. We know what this means.
Yeah, shut the fuck up Friday. Don't talk to the cops.
Don't talk to the fucking cops. But he's so charmed. It takes Sloane nothing. He doesn't even have to give him scones to get him to soften up. He's just like, oh, come, I'll chat a little professionally or, kind of, I think flatter you professionally, and then it's in. And he's just so relaxed. And he's convinced, like he has a confidence that the system will work the way he expects. The senior officers will be asked questions. Sloane will find out something. The world will continue on, and he won't make it to his conference, but if that's the worst thing that happens, c'est la vie. He's surprised to get the call saying he's under suspicion from O'Brien, which O'Brien clearly recorded, clearly stiff and...
That has the vibe of when a GM in a role-playing game feels like the players haven't quite gotten it. That feels like Sloane was back in the control booth being like, he's not worried yet. Have his friend tell him to be worried. Yeah.
And tiny digression. Later, as this goes on, we learn all sorts of weird shit about, Bashir's lied in this way. These are really summations of stuff that have already happened in DS9, but he's lied and he's done these things that are questionable, and even Sisko's a little giving him the side eye. This man has no imposter syndrome, right? If I came out of that interview, and then O'Brien was like, they're suspicious of you, and he's like, okay, I guess I'll keep trucking, I would be questioning every single thing in my whole life and career, right? But no, not this man.
That's not Bashir's deal. Bashir's like, of course, I know I'm smart and correct at all things, so it has to be them that's the problem.
Right.
And it turns out he's right.
And he's right. So as this goes on, Bashir picks up until, it takes this progression, but he picks up kind of just the clues he's been given. It's clear he's supposed to notice the room was searched. It's clear he's supposed to, that there's something just a little bit weird about the food. Oh, it must be a mix-up. He's just playing at this very superficial level with the simulation that he is in. We joked about the holodecks, but holodecks are fully woven into Star Trek society, right? Mm-hmm. Holodecks are not new to anybody. All of these motherfuckers have had holodeck incidences.
There's surely a class at the academy where they go over how to recognize that you're in the holodeck.
Right. And he just completely lives in the astonishment of that moment of, oh God, I'm under suspicion by internal affairs and this is going sideways. What's happening?
I do feel like there's a shift when he's brought to the brig, where he shifts from that sort of bafflement to a sort of resignation, a sort of existentialist resignation of oh, I don't think he realizes it's a fake world, but he realizes that it's not, he's no longer operating under justice, he's operating under something else.
That's true. That is true. The fact that he holds true to not thinking he's a spy, not giving into this engrammatic whatever dissociation idea, I think is also kind of part of that, his willingness to believe a system exists, even if he doesn't entirely grok what it is yet. But we see, by setting Bashir up in this way, this episode attempts to get the viewer hooked in as well with, surely Starfleet wouldn't be this dark. Surely it wouldn't have something this dark, right? We're just going layer and layer deeper on this. And there's this shift, as Roddenberry's hands, Gene Roddenberry's hands, kind of come off the reins of Star Trek in this Deep Space Nine era. We see more and more of this. And some of the writers have talked about how, they're like, well, doesn't there have to be a downside? Doesn't there have to be a cost for this utopia? And they pluck at it in various ways before introducing Section 31. And a lot of it comes to that, ends justifying the means type of thing, which I'm going to guess Greg is going to talk about in quite a bit of detail.
Absolutely.
That's kind of an easy push-pull. DS9 has set itself up very well, and I'll talk about this later, very well for the kind of entrenched war where you want to play these games. But even, there are a lot of bad admirals in Star Trek. There are So many bad admirals. And some of them are criminals. Some of them are taken away and they are stripped of power and the system says, no, you were not supposed to exist. Some of them are okay. Some of them are allowed. There was, and I don't know why I remembered this, but there's a TNG episode where there's some sort of sabotage and an admiral comes on board to, like, lead this investigation. It becomes a witch hunt, but she brings a betazoid with her. Mm-hmm. She brings a goddamn telepath. What? That's weird and unethical. And it's just like, okay, just got this betazoid on my team that's just going to come on in and help me with this investigation, right? That admiral was cleared to do that, right? Mm-hmm. These sorts of little things come up all the time. And one thing that strikes me is how the way it establishes that utopia is by, with that shock compared to how we would be shocked or not shocked at the equivalent happening.
Yeah. If someone told me the CIA existed, I would be like, yeah, I know.
We know, right? And that they do bad things and that they do torture that isn't well crafted to get the results they want. Who'da thunk, right? These are not things we are surprised at. But by setting up that contrast, by the fact that a grown man with a professional career in a military organization can reach the age of 35 or however old he is and be shocked at this, says a lot for the state of the society. Bashir is just such a weirdo that, you can only take him so seriously, but his interest in spy stuff and yet being so shocked that it exists was just like, oh god, okay, let's take a look at this whole thing. When I thought about this episode originally, I had thought that this gauntlet he runs was in part to assess how smart he was, and this is part of me, I think, mixing up the children and, several of these things that he's mixed up in. And the fact that when he didn't catch that it was simulation quickly, I was like, well, they're clearly not in test. They're not testing that reasoning.
So Melissa foreshadowed this very helpfully. Yes. I want to talk about whether the ends justify the means. This is a classic Star Trek moral conundrum, and it's sort of one of the central questions of this episode is like, is it okay to kill or kidnap or so on and so forth, break the principles of Starfleet in order to protect the Federation? And Bashir is on the side of like, the ends do not justify the means. They literally say this out loud. Bashir is like, the ends don't justify the means. You should not sacrifice your principles in order to survive. Sloane says, no, the ends do justify the means. And we're sort of presented as like, which one of these people is correct? Whereas in reality, like, these are absolute positions, right? Like, these are like extreme positions on the sort of ethical perspective. So I want to talk a little bit about like different ethical approaches and how they show up here. So, Lucy, you're the philosopher, so please speak up if I get something mixed up. But there's sort of three big categories of ethics that people tend to talk about. There's virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialist ethics. So virtue ethics is when you say moral behavior is about being a good person, act correctly, and it's good for your soul, good for your happiness. Like, try and be right at all times and act in accordance with virtue, and it will be good for you. And, helping others will help yourself. That's sort of the virtue ethics. So, like, think, like, Worf is a good example of virtue ethics, where Worf is like, I'm going to act with honor, I'm going to be a good Klingon, be a good officer, and that will bring me to Sto-vo-kor or whatever, right? Deontology is saying being good is about fulfilling duties and following moral principles. So that's Bashir. Bashir is saying, I have a duty to the Federation, I have a duty to my fellow crewmates, I believe in the principles set forth in the Starfleet Charter, all of this stuff. And then consequentialism says that morality is based on the outcome of your actions. So like utilitarianism is a consequentialist philosophy where you're like, whichever option results in the best outcome is the most moral, regardless of the method you use. And that's Sloane's argument here, is that like, if it saves the Federation, then it is worth it, even if it means we have to crack a few eggs. And The reason I am going into so much detail is because I think that this episode is playing with these perspectives. I think that we get examples of each of these in the opening scene of the episode. So the opening scene of the episode is when O'Brien comes in to get his shoulder fixed. It opens with Bashir talking to Odo, and Bashir's like, I'm going to go to a conference. And Odo says, is it going to be at a resort again? You doctors are always putting your conferences at resorts. And Bashir says, well, we have a grim profession. And so that's a statement of virtue ethics. That's saying that, like, Bashir deserves pleasure, doctors deserve to relax and to experience joy because they have been magnanimous and shared their abilities to benefit others. Like, there's no principle that says because you're a doctor you get to have a vacation, and there's no, like, the consequence link there. It's just that, like, oh, well, part of living a good life is to help others and also get to relax proportionally to that. And then O'Brien shows up, and O'Brien's shoulder is dislocated, and Bashir says, hey, you promised me that you wouldn't kayak until your shoulder healed, and yet you did so. And so that's a betrayal, right? Bashir is calling O'Brien out on deontological basis. He's saying, you promised this, you established a duty to me, and then you violated that duty, so you've done me a wrong. And then O'Brien pushes back and says, oh, but the river calls to me. I enjoy kayaking, and so it's worth it to break my promise in order to get the pleasure of kayaking. And Bashir comes back with an equally consequentialist response, which is, well, it will hurt you. The river is calling to you because it's going to hurt you, and so you shouldn't do it because you will get hurt, right? So we start off with, I deserve this because I'm a good person. Then we go into, you've betrayed me and that's bad because of the violation of your promise. And then it switches to, you should consider the consequences of your actions when choosing to do what's right.
Nice.
Right. So that first scene, like, does all of that. Is it intentional? Probably not, but I think it's really cool that those all show up. And like, if we look at, like, what is actually the way to be moral? And quick aside here, all these are talking about individual morality. There's a lot of morality that's ethical philosophy that's talking about, like, well, is it really an individual thing, or is it that we need to create a moral society within which people can live moral lives rather than every person choosing morality for themselves? Mm-hmm. But anyway, generally speaking, the ends do justify the means, right? Like, it is sometimes, often, to some extent, right? Like, it is worth it to, if you're a surgeon, cutting someone is okay when you're performing surgery, right? Like, that's a contextual thing where hurting someone is okay if it's to prevent a larger hurt. And like, each of these three perspectives is insufficient on its own to provide a consistent moral action that feels good to us. Like, virtue ethics is kind of tautological. Virtue ethics is saying a good person is one who performs good acts, and you can recognize a good act because they're the things a good person does. And these are the list of virtues that we see as being the properties of a good person. So you kind of need external reference to be able to hook that into anything material. I
think it's ontological because it has to be based on something, right? You imagine that there is some sort of moral system beyond an individual that those virtues are based on.
Yeah. But what is that moral system? As soon as you say, well, it's the 10 Commandments, then you're into deontology. And deontology has the problem of, like, which rules do you follow, right? Mm-hmm. The classic cliche, slavery was legal in the United States, right? It was permitted, it was enshrined in the Constitution, and so, but it was evil. We know it was evil.
They knew it was evil.
They knew it was evil, right? Yeah. They had people shouting it that it was evil. They had a war about it. So it's not enough to just say there is this law, we should follow it in order to be moral. So which rules, which duties are moral duties is a thing you have to decide based on other factors. Mm-hmm. And then utilitarianism has all sorts of issues with, or consequentialism has issues with, like, how do you measure how good a consequence is compared to the ethical costs? And Star Trek kind of wants to be absolute about this. Star Trek tries to say, well, the ends never justify the means. It is never okay to violate your principles in order to protect people. And then this episode seems to believe that, and the very next episode after this one is In the Pale Moonlight, which is an episode where Sisko is accessory to murder in order to trick the Romulan Empire into joining the Federation's side in the Dominion War. And so that episode ends with Sisko saying, I violated the principles, and I do it again. And I feel bad about it, but I do it again. And so that episode is kind of saying, well, the ends often justify the means. Mm-hmm. It feels like things Star Trek is not equipped to reckon with. Because Star Trek wants to think that morality just kind of arises out of a society that holds the right principles. And then, increasingly, since DS9 has complicated that and been like, oh, well, not really. You do still get bad people.
Yeah, it's tempting to also lay that at the feet of a Roddenberry / post-Roddenberry sort of push-pull. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's entirely the case. There also seems to be kind of a post-Cold War thing that is present in post-Star Trek Next Generation material as well. That sort of brings some of that muddiness to the fore of, to what extent do the ends justify the means. Star Trek really struggles. The ways at which it wants to pretend to be nuanced don't bottle up well, and definitely don't stay consistent. That is, I think, a factor of time and number of writers. Mm-hmm. I think there's just the realities of making a TV show of that style in that era, where you don't get the cohesiveness that you can pull off in sort of modern prestige television, and then, smear that over 6 decades.
Yeah. Well, with the main topics covered, it's time for a quick lightning round of other interesting things we spotted. Melissa, you mentioned spies earlier.
I did mention spies earlier. So, this era of Star Trek is utterly fascinated with spies and spying. Like, the writers, producers, whoever, we didn't call them showrunners at the time, but these folks have set themselves up for high spy time. They made the Changelings, right? Mm-hmm. They're like, we're going to have this ongoing war with a shape-shifting race, and we're going to start you by thinking these people can't look perfectly human, right? We got Odo running around looking like, a wooden model. Trick you with all of this. They have established this ongoing war with multiple factions in very sort of static locations. And there aren't any massive tech differences between them, right? This isn't a Borg Federation situation where you're constantly modulating your weapons and blah, 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 your iMod and all this sort of shit. Everyone is sort of, plus minus 1, 2, depending on where you are. And everyone's very static. It feels, this is the most Star Trek has ever felt like a bunch of countries sitting right next to each other, maybe one of them separated by a body of water, right? Mm-hmm. It's weirdly static. And it also gives, they didn't achieve that with the Cold War era of Klingons and Romulans. Everything felt much spaced out. There were frontiers involved, right? We were exploring the space and sort of moving through it. This era of Star Trek, this DS9 era of Star Trek, feels like it's sitting in a world and in a space that can be traversed. So this kind of gets back to our Star Trek Voyager Elite Force discussions about navigating space. When you have spies and you're gathering intel, sending them off into the frontier is very different than sending them somewhere that they can infiltrate because it is a fairly known space, right? That gives a very different vibe and a very different feel. And it's interesting to me that, when I think of James Bond, or, which, Bashir is, I think, pretty clearly basically playing in his holodeck simulations, right? He's doing a very James Bond thing. I think of James Bond as a Cold War spy, right?
Yeah.
Not a modern day spy. I don't even know what modern day spies do. Probably hack things. But that kind of spy might not exist in the late 90s. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so it's a weird sort of juxtaposition of like, okay, we want to take these bits of this political situation. We want to take what American audiences, what will seem more real to American audiences, which is like, okay, we think of, I don't know, the Middle East, or we think of, Eastern Europe, or like wherever we think conflict is happening and how snug and tight everything is there, and make that real. And of course, I think Babylon 5 is probably a competing sort of, or a contemporaneous, rather, sort of set of ideals on that kind of war as well. We also kind of come into an era where our real world ability to do interesting makeup becomes more real. And that opens up the kinds of spying you can have. There have always been instances, I think, even all the way back to the original series, where someone is imitating another species to spy. Someone will put on some pointy ears. Someone will, put a little green dust on their face. But our ability to do better movie makeup means that in universe, from TNG onward, there's better species crossing spy makeup until you get to, can they test my blood? Up until this becomes introduced, you get a lot more of a certain kind of spying that, gets to the kind of costuming that in the real world we want to think spies do. In TNG, you see that sort of cross-species stuff used for, like, I think a few First Contact type episodes, specifically with, like, pre-warp civilizations, right? Like, we're going to pretend to be one of them and be like, hello, and see if we can get whatever it is we want out of them. But DS9 just, like, puts this in for war. Like, we are going to pretend to be Cardassians, we're going to do this sort of stuff. And this era, it's interesting because I'm curious why, like, assuming they weren't just cribbing off of Babylon 5 and, wanting to mimic that, I'm curious why they decided to bring that fascination right to the forefront in the DS9 era, and I'm not sure why. But it makes for good TV. I mean, DS9 has a known spy in it. I believe Garrick is 100% confirmed to be a spy, right?
Yes. Yeah, they eventually,
Yeah.
By the time his, like, spy implants are breaking down, it's confirmed.
Yeah.
What year did this episode come out?
In the real world?
Yes.
1998.
Okay. So, history has ended, and 9/11 has not yet happened.
History has ended.
Yeah. So we're in this point of, like, where is the enemy, right? Like, we have this society, especially in the US, that's, like, set up to be in opposition to communism, essentially, right? And suddenly it looks like communism's just done. We've got China, who is increasingly less communist, and then we've got, Cuba and a few little things, and the USSR is broken up. So, like, we know there must be an enemy because our entire society behaves as if there is an enemy, but who is it? And maybe that's the part of the fascination of, like, they're hiding among us, right?
Yeah, I was trying to think of what some of the major conflicts would have been at the time. I was very politically unaware at the time of what sort of late 90s stuff was going on, in the world, but clearly nothing huge. The things I remember from that era are, ranging from, are all very domestic things. Bill Clinton did a thing, and OJ did a thing, and...
Might have been the Bosnian conflict going on?
I was just gonna look up, like, Bosnia, Sarajevo, and surely something Palestine-Israel was going on, right?
Sure, yeah.
But...
because this is after the first Gulf War, I think, and before the second.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the second Gulf War, I want to talk about truth a little bit. Because the second Gulf War was based on a lie. This episode is, like, really playing in interesting ways with what truth means, because, like, the truth of the hologram simulation, one of the weird things about it is none of these characters are real. right? None of the familiar characters we see. Sisko, like, tries to defend Bashir, apparently, but that's holographic Sisko. And there's a point where holographic Sisko is like, well, either you're lying or you don't know, and I don't think you're lying, right? And so, like, there's this thing of, like, is it true in the fiction of the holo simulation? Is it true that Bashir has been brainwashed? And it can be true, like, he can be lying or he can be wrong. And there's a difference between dishonesty and misapprehension of the truth that's, like, very clearly setting up this fuzziness, the spy style approach of, like, well, nothing really is true here, right? Mm-hmm. Especially because the claim that Bashir has been brainwashed is not falsifiable. Sisko points this out. It's circular reasoning, right? It's, well, he had an opportunity to be brainwashed. And if he was brainwashed, he's so smart that we wouldn't be able to detect that he was brainwashed. He wouldn't even be able to detect it himself. So the very fact that he claims he's not brainwashed is kind of support for the idea that he is. And there's this, like, Kafka-esque, right? This is clearly doing a Kafka here, the trial, that sort of thing. And, like, the episode is sort of talking about truth not existing, right? Like, all these discussions of, well, is Bashir lying or is he wrong? And people acting as if he's lying and betraying them when the truth that they've been provided is that he is fooling himself, right? People are like, how could you, Bashir? And, like, you know the answer of how could you, because he was brainwashed, purportedly. And then the episode goes, oh, and none of that is true, right? Not only is the concept of truth within the simulation questionable, but the entire world, the premises are untrue. And so I don't know where to go with that, but Star Trek is usually going, things are real. We know what's real. We can ask the computer. We can use our scanners and we can tell. And people can have differing opinions about that. But we can all agree on the reality of the situation. And then this episode is like, can you, though? Who says? Who says how many days you were in captivity? Who says whether or not you're capable of this? Like, this episode would not work if there was a test for engrammatic dissociation.
Right.
If they could put an implant behind your ear and scan your neurological patterns and be like, oh, no, he's not brainwashed, then this episode wouldn't happen. Because Bashir would be like, I'll do the test myself, or have Dax do it. So,
do you feel like, though, that truth is sort of reestablished at the end when they come out of the holodeck?
Yeah. Yes, but we're immediately presented with the question of, what's up with Section 31, right? Like, Bashir comes out and is like, I was kidnapped by some people. Here's the wound behind my ear where they took the implant out. They're from Section 31, and everyone's like, well, let's check with Starfleet to see if Section 31 is real. And they won't say yes or no.
But they don't doubt Bashir. I mean, no one there is doubting Bashir's story.
Right.
That's true.
But they're still, like, they're still having trouble holding on to truth there, right? And I think that there's even in that scene, there's an interesting ambiguity with Sisko's final line, because Melissa said Sisko orders Bashir to agree. But what Sisko actually says is, the next time Section 31 shows up, you'll say yes. And it's not like, I think the read that he's giving an order is correct, because that's how Sisko gives orders, but also it could be read as a prediction of, like, you won't be able to resist. And I don't know, it feels like the intrigue has escaped the simulation to me, and, like, everyone's second-guessing themselves.
I mean, if anybody should ever be wondering if anyone is real or brainwashed or in a holodeck, it should be the senior officers on Deep Space Nine.
Yes.
For real. See,
they should just constantly be checking clocks, looking away from text and looking back to see if it changes, asking people questions about their childhood.
They should honestly just stay together in a pack at all times.
And test each other's blood all the time. Just do, like, a little diabetic test, right? Just see if blood will well up. Okay, cool, you're not changing. Do the whole thing.
Just a bunch of anemic senior staff on a border station. falling asleep as the Dominion invades.
Well, I have said for a long time that Deep Space Nine is my favorite of the Treks. I don't know if that's still true. But one of the things that I find really interesting about Deep Space Nine is it's really different from all the other shows because it's so stable. Deep Space Nine is centered around a space station. So things happen on Deep Space Nine and people leave and come back, but it still has this sort of, it's still centering this location and this place in a way that other Star Treks don't, because ships, although they're places, they move around and go to different places. And the space station stays where it is.
Mostly.
And I think the thing that is interesting is the set of the Promenade on Deep Space Nine. I can't think of an analog to the Promenade on any other of the shows because it's like a public square, right? It's a place where there aren't just Starfleet people, but civilians and Bajorans, and a place where all religious people and military people and mercantile Ferengi. So it has such a diversity of types of people and that sort of public square quality. It was particularly striking in this episode when it's in the holodeck, but Bashir is paraded through in handcuffs through the Promenade. So like being taken away in chains or whatever publicly. I thought it reminded me of that scene in Game of Thrones when Cersei is paraded through the town, like that sort of public humiliation. And I was like, wow, I don't know that this could have happened. Like when on the Enterprise would that happen, right? Like I guess you could take somebody through the 10 forward, but that wouldn't be the same,
It wouldn't be the route.
Yeah, there's not a public square quality elsewhere. And I just think that the Promenade sort of symbolizes something that's, I'll say special and interesting about Deep Space Nine, in that it's a place where different kinds of stories can be told. And I don't think this particular episode is actually telling one of those. I don't think it's doing the kinds of things that I like that Deep Space Nine does. But I do think that scene was particularly striking to me in that I don't think it could have happened on any other series. Mm-hmm. And I think it was particularly important that it happened because for Bashir, his reputation. His reputation is really important to him, right? Like, it's important to him that how he is perceived, that he is perceived as this good and smart doctor. So that public humiliation, I think, is particularly organized to do something for him in his brain. I thought it was interesting to think about the Promenade in that way.
Yeah. One of my favorite things about the Promenade, this might be going back to truth a little bit, but like, that set is real, right? Like, the Promenade set and all of its most of its connecting rooms are real places connected to each other on a real set. You know, most of the time in a TV show, each room is kind of on a separate stage. But in DS9's case, you really could start in Quarks, walk outside, climb some stairs, get up to that railing, look over the railing, come back down, go into Keiko's school, come out.
Whoa.
Like, those are all physical locations. Not the brig, the Odo's constabulary might be separate, but most of those sites are real physical spaces.
That's really cool.
I think the constabulary is part of it too, because you can often see people in the background entering and exiting of it. And I think similar to that, I think the way that there's like a balcony that you can look over, like, it creates, almost a Shakespearean, like a theatrical component to the show, where I feel like a lot of times, it's very tight, you're on the bridge, and that's what you're showing is people on the bridge, and people standing at the promenade overlooking things that are happening. Like, it just has such a different vibe.
That's just where Jake Sisko lives, right? It just lives up there all night, right? Let's immediately, as soon as you said railing, I'm like...
His feet dangling over the edge.
Totally.
So we're already kind of drifting in the direction of 10 Forward. So let's shift over and talk about stuff that we geeked out about as Star Trek fans. So I'm going to start with talking about dudes. So we all know that Bashir is queer and that Garak is his husband. But... There's an awesome intimacy between Bashir and O'Brien on the show. Like, O'Brien is the straightest man on television. But he and Bashir are, like, almost achingly good friends, right? They know each other's foibles. The joy with which Bashir pops O'Brien's shoulder back into its socket and is like, you've been kayaking again. That's like the familiarity of an old married couple, but like and a real physical intimacy, right? Like, Bashir's betrayal at O'Brien like saying, "How could you, Julian?" or whatever O'Brien says, and then his almost palpable relief when he realizes that O'Brien's shoulder isn't hurt, and so this must not be real, right? Like, all of the evidence that Bashir has seen that he is in a holodeck simulation. How does Weyu know his scone order? How could they have transported him? How could a Dominion ship have transported him out of the brig of a space station? Didn't get him. But as soon as he looks at O'Brien and is like, even if he's being mean to me, I need to be careful because his shoulder is hurt. Wait a second. Like, there's that beautiful, beautiful relationship. And you see it other places. I think that definitely Sloane and Bashir have a sort of like an intimacy to the progress of their relationship with, like, initially they're friendly and Sloane's like, let me get you breakfast. What do you want for breakfast? What's your breakfast order? And then Bashir's, when his quarters are searched, he shifts and becomes very cold to Sloane. He doesn't say, hey, you mixed up my breakfast order, because he's like, no, I'm not going to give him the benefit of that. There's no, at least in different episodes of DS9 do this different amounts. This episode has dudes being close to dudes, both physically and emotionally, and no amount of like, oh, but we need to be at a distance because we're afraid of queerness. And it's really lovely.
Yeah. There's no homo in DS9.
Yeah. You've just got, everyone knows each other. and in an intimate, close, domestic way, like you would if you lived together and worked together so closely.
You forgot about Odo and Quark. I know they don't really figure into this episode.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah.
Yeah, and Odo and Quark, they're not really even friends, but they're life partners. They very rarely want to spend time around each other, but they are always spending time around each other, and so they have this relationship that's built up almost like grooves in the ground of their movements around each other, where it's like, this is the way that we can live together and both get what we need and not cause trouble for each other. And yeah, it's cool. O'Brien calling Bashir, even though it's fake, O'Brien calling Bashir immediately.
Yeah.
And O'Brien knows that they can detect this message, and yet he's like, they asked me about you for 2 hours. And then Bashir, the smart thing to do for Bashir would be to, as soon as they come up to pick him up, be like, hey, just want to let you know, I don't think it's anything malicious. O'Brien did contact me. I don't want you to think that I'm keeping secrets from you. He doesn't.
Nope, you don't narc out a friend.
He does not tattle on O'Brien, even though that would be the smart move. And yeah, love it.
Well, to be fair, I'm going to geek about something that I love that's not even Star Trek, and that is academic conferences.
It's very Star Trek. They're going on academic conferences all the time.
No, I know. That's the thing I love about Star Trek is how often people are going to academic conferences and symposiums for whatever reason. I think Starfleet or the Federation has an annual symposium that sometimes figures in. People are forever going to... In fact, I mean, I do feel like you should have extra security if you're going to a conference, because it does seem to be a time when you are most likely to be waylaid.
Yeah, that's a line in this episode. Sloan is like, last time you went to an academic conference, you got kidnapped by the Dominion.
Yeah, that's right.
And ironically, here, he got kidnapped by Section 31.
But despite it all, these people still want to go to academic conferences. And I love it. You know, if you get your paper accepted at that medical conference that Bashir wants to go to, I mean, he wants to go and read his paper, have a drink with his friends, like whatever resort this is like. And this is really true. If you're not in academics, like when I'm looking at the calendar for next year for conferences I'm going to submit to, what I'm looking at are where are those conferences being held? Because like if the answer is like the big conference that I really like to go to, last year the answer was Ohio. Guess what? I did not submit. So all of this is very real and I love it about Star Trek.
There was one thing that I found unrealistic, though, which is that Bashir just says, I'm going to present a paper at a medical conference. And, like, knowing Bashir and knowing academics, I feel like he would have found some way to mention the topic of his paper about 5 times this episode.
Well, here's, like...
They would have been like, we've canceled you. Oh, well, I won't be able to present on denobulin flu.
I know that is not true for most people, though. Like... Some of my friends, like, their partners don't even know what their work is on or what their papers are on. And if I was talking to someone who I did not think was very interested, I certainly would not bring it up. Like, so...
Okay.
Not even Dax? You don't think he would have been like, oh, Jadzia won't be able to talk about boils on bolians?
Well, it wouldn't have been really appropriate to the moment.
I guess.
Just because y'all are weirdos who are actually interested in academic paper topics, like that's just not how. Like a lot of people are just not like that.
Huh? That's unfortunate for them.
Yeah, it's super interesting.
Yeah, it's good shit. All right, so I just want to geek out briefly about William Sadler, who is the actor who played Sloan, Luther Sloan, in this episode. So this was the introduction of Section 31, like I mentioned, to all of Star Trek. It did not exist before this episode, chronologically, in our time. And to me, William Sadler is Section 31. Mm-hmm. Like, if you said Section 31, it is immediately his face. To be fair, I did used to get him confused with Willem Dafoe when I was a child, because I do think they look alike.
Reasonable.
At least, 20 years ago. Discovery does interesting things with Section 31, like all, various other shows have touched on, but William Sadler is Section 31. Here's an interesting piece of trivia about Sadler. He also played a law enforcement officer in another well-known, surely beloved to somebody, science fiction series named Roswell. He was Sheriff Jim Valenti in the 1999 TV series Roswell. Apparently there was a later adaptation of that book series also. I don't know why people keep adapting that book series, but he was the sheriff of Roswell, New Mexico in 1999. Less sus there than he is as the head of Section 31, but the man seems to like certain kind of sci-fi.
He does have a face.
There's a good ambiguity in him. Like, he is completely believable as this unprincipled spy who's willing to do terrible things. But also, like, when it's like, well, he lost his son to the Jem'Hadar, you're like, oh, well, maybe that is really what he's after. Maybe he is just a sad man.
Mm-hmm.
He does a good job at playing those two faces.
Yeah, he has an affability that I think Defoe struggles with. Defoe looks like a villain quite a lot when he pops up being villainous. Whereas I think like that early scene, that first interview where Sloane is being chummy with Bashir almost works, right? Like, obviously he pulls the wool over on Bashir's eyes, but yeah. So anyway, William Sadler seems great. Hopefully not the most problematic motherfucker. I only did a brief sort of what's he doing on the internet these days. But
I Googled William Sadler controversy.
I did.
Let's not.
Welcome to 2024.
Ready?
Yes.
At the end of each episode, we pick the next thing we're watching based on a connection from this episode. This episode had a main character who didn't go to a conference.
Oh no. It's gonna be so many episodes.
It's gonna be every episode.
So next time...
I guess very few episodes involve someone going to a conference. So we're watching Measure of a Man, which does not involve an academic conference. Time for Butcher's Knife Cares Not for the Lamb's Cry.
Now, wouldn't it be sad if I picked one of those? Now I'd be crying.
It would be hilarious.
Next time, we're watching an episode where a main character considers going to an academic conference, but then chooses to go on vacation instead. So we're watching Captain's Holiday from Season 3, Episode 19 of The Next Generation.
Yes.
Oh,
that's
shit.
with, what's her name?
Vosh.
Vash?
Vosh, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Who ends up shacking up with Q eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
This is the first Vosh episode.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah, so the episode is actually not about an academic conference.
They do some archaeology or something, right?
It's about-
We'll find out, I guess.
Picard goes on vacation, and then, like, there's intrigue, and it is sort of archaeological in nature, the intrigue. But it'll probably be fun. You can find it on Paramount or wherever else you get your Trek.
All right. So next time, we'll be discussing A Captain's Holiday on Before the Future Came. You can find links to some of the stuff we've discussed, a lot of references this episode, I think, and show notes at beforethefuture.space. If you could, we would love it if you could rate us on Apple Podcasts, 5 stars. Also, wherever you found your show, but especially Apple Podcasts, since that apparently is where most people find podcasts. And if you want to share your thoughts with us, please do. We love getting feedback. You can comment on our website. You can contact us on Instagram and TikTok. Just search for Before the Future Came and find our account there. Or you can write us at onscreen@beforethefuture.space.
I'm Lucy Arnold, and sometimes blog at intertextualities.com.
I'm Melissa Avery-Weir, and I live at urson.net and on Mastodon as melissa@urson.life.
And I'm Gregory Avery-Weir, and you can find me at ludusnovus.net or on Blue Sky at gregoryaveryweir.bsky.social. Our music is Let's Pretend by Josh Woodward, used under a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license. Thanks for listening.
I'm sure we'll all live happily ever after, surrounded by butterflies, children, and laughter. It's a fairy tale story, so let's just pretend. Hallelujah, amen, it's the end. Happily